Hello everyone, this video is on early childhood education, lesson planning for edTPA Task 1. I'm Dr. Muriel Rand from New Jersey City University. So getting started with Task 1 and lesson planning, first you're going to choose a class. If you're teaching multiple classes, just choose one. And then you're going to choose, you're going to work with everyone in your class, but you're going to specifically focus on two students, one of whom has specific learning needs, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then you're going to get permission to video record and use work samples for your portfolio. So start that right now because it might take a little while for you to get permission. The next step is to fill out the Context for Learning form. This form is used by edTPA just so that the scorers understand your setting and your background so that they can make sense of your lesson plans. So you're going to describe your setting, what kind of school you're working at, urban, rural, suburban, etc., how many kids you have, what your curriculum is, all those kind of questions. And then the next section is to describe any of the students you have with specific learning needs. And edTPA uses this very broadly. So it could be children that have an IEP or a 504 plan that are in special education, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be English language learners. You'll see that there are 3 sections on the form. The first section is for children who have an IEP, and you can put in there what their accommodations or modifications are. Then the second section is for communication issues. So this is where English language learners would fall, or any other students that might have communication problems. And then the last section of that form are for any kinds of students who you might need to modify your instruction or the curriculum for. So students who are struggling and might need more support, or perhaps you have students who are gifted and need more of a challenge, or maybe just students who have trouble focusing and need some support during their lessons. So any students like that are what edTPA considers students with specific learning needs. And you will need one of your focus students has to be from that category. So one of your focus students has to be from one of those categories at the end of the form. And make sure you're maintaining privacy. Do not use any names. Don't use names of teachers or your name. Don't use names of the state or the school that you're working at. Okay, now let's get started with creating your 3 lesson plans. The 3 lesson plans are going to go together and they're going to have a common focus. So basically you're teaching the same thing across 3 lessons, and the lessons are going to build on each other. So either what you're asking them to do gets a little bit more difficult, or maybe you're asking them to do the same thing, but you give them more independence. So you help them less in each lesson. But however you decide to do this, the 3 lessons have to go together and they have to follow each other. They don't have to be taught one day after another, especially with the way we're teaching right now, but they do have to be consecutive. So if you only see your students 2 days a week, then you teach 1 lesson in 2 lessons, and then the next week you do the 3rd lesson. The lessons must be focused on literacy. So you're going to choose a literacy standard, and they must be interdisciplinary. So you're also going to choose an interdisciplinary standard. So for literacy, you're going to have, it's going to be either reading or writing. And your interdisciplinary standard, I would suggest science, social studies, or art. So the first step is to choose your standard, and then the next step is going to be to create an objective based on that standard. So you're going to identify a specific goal that has an observable learning outcome. That means that you can actually see the kids doing it. So don't use words like learn or comprehend. We can't see kids comprehend. We can't see kids learn. What we can do is we can see them respond to questions. We can see them choose a particular picture. We can see them write an essay or to label a picture, but we can't see learning directly. So make sure that the words that you're using in your objective are observable. And then you're going to state the conditions under which the learning will occur. So what materials, what texts, what facilities, and what time period will they have to demonstrate their learning. And then finally, the objective must match the standard very closely. Some of the English language arts standards have a lot of parts to them, in which case you just pick one piece of it. You're not going to teach everything in that standard. Like, for example, there's a standard that is about the the elements of a narrative, a narrative story. So it might be setting and characters and plot and conclusion, but you wouldn't have to teach that all in one lesson. You could teach a lesson that's just on plot and use that standard, or you could teach a lesson that's just on characters and use that standard. Or in the writing standards as well, they are quite complex. So if you're teaching narrative writing, again, it might say that they've got to have an create a setting, a narrator or a character, and then episodes, and then a conclusion. Same thing. You don't have to teach that all in one lesson. You could teach it over the 3 lessons, or even longer than that. You might only teach one of those 2 things over the 3 lessons. So let me get into more detail about the choices of standards. For your literacy standard, the New Jersey State Learning Standards have 6 categories: reading literature, reading informational text, reading foundational skills, speaking and listening, writing, and language. You can only use 3 of those, or your choice, you have to choose from only 3 of those because edTPA requires it to be reading or writing. So the reading literature and reading informational text are the comprehension standards. Reading literature means fiction. It's a narrative, it's a story, and reading informational text is nonfiction. So that's you would use an informational book and help them to comprehend. And then the writing, there are also 3 different kinds of writing within the writing standards: narrative, explanatory, informational, and persuasive. And you would just use one of those. Now, when you're writing your standard, make sure that you're using the grade level indicator. And you can tell it's the grade level indicator because it has your grade level in it. So the example I have on the screen is RLPK2. You can tell that's the grade level indicator because that is pre-K. RI 1.7, again, you can tell it's the grade level indicator because it has the 1 in there for first grade. If you look at the little text box I have there, if it says NJCU, that is the anchor standard, and that is not what you use in your lesson plan. That anchor standard is a description of what they're going to learn by the end of 12th grade. That's why it's the anchor standard, because that's where they're going to. So every year it builds towards being able to do what's in the anchor standard. So it's not going to be helpful to you because it's not specific to your grade level. So don't use that one. So again, you must integrate one other content area besides literacy, and my suggestion is to do science or social studies or art. The science and social studies work really well if you're using the reading informational text standards, because you can choose a book that's got a science topic or a book that's got a social studies topic. And the art works well if you're choosing the reading literature standard, because that is about storybooks, so they can use art to demonstrate their comprehension. And for writing, you could use any one of those, because you could have students writing a book about a social studies topic, or they could, if you're in the lower grades, they could draw something they learned about science and label it. They could also obviously use art to illustrate their own story as well. So let's take a look at some examples of objectives. Here's the first one. After reading the book about sharks, students will be able to draw a picture of one science fact they learned from the book and label it during independent practice. So that's how I'm integrating science. And you'll notice that I describe what the outcome is, and it's to draw a picture of a science fact, but I also describe when they will be doing that and under what conditions. So they'll draw it during independent practice, and it will be after reading a book about sharks. The next one with arts integration is the students will be able to use art skills to accurately create illustrations for a story during small group time by drawing the main character, setting, and 2 plot episodes. Here's another one. During small group time, students will accurately identify 3 community helpers that were in our book from a variety of pictures. So this is the social studies integration. And again, notice how I'm making it very clear what they need to do. Students will accurately identify 3 community helpers. I do not say students will learn about community helpers, because we can't see that. Students will accurately identify 3 community helpers. And finally, using the graphic organizer during center time, students will be able to draw a picture, scribble, write, or dictate 3 characteristics of winter for our class book. So again, it tells me what I want them to do. They have to identify 3 characteristics of winter. Again, I'm not saying they'll learn about winter or they'll identify something about winter. I'm very specific. They will identify 3 characteristics of winter for a class book. And I also say, when they're going to be doing this and under what conditions. So I hope that that is helpful in getting a feel for the way to write objectives. The next part is your assessment. The informal assessment, that's the term that edTPA calls formative assessment. So informal assessment is throughout the lesson. So this is how you observe to make sure that everything's going well and that you don't have to repeat things or go faster or make it harder or make it easier, and to make sure that the kids are getting it all throughout the lesson. You can't wait until the end to find out that they didn't understand what you did at the beginning. So mostly you'll describe just how you're going to observe and what you're going to look for. You could use a checklist or ask them some questions, but this is going to be informal and it's got to be throughout the lesson. Your formal assessment is at the end of the lesson. That will be during your independent practice, and it's exactly the same as your objective. So if you go back and look at those objectives, they tell me exactly what I need to use for my formal assessment. Okay, now that we've gotten that done, let's look at the instructional strategies and learning tasks. First of all, you're going to provide enough detail for someone else to carry out your lesson. That's how edTPA describes the level of detail they want. They give you up to 4 pages per lesson plan, but I found that most people don't need 4. 2 to 3 is usually fine. You're going to start with your anticipatory set and your review. The anticipatory set is how you link the learning to what they have already done. So that's why you're going to review a little bit of what you did before, link it to this lesson, and get them excited about it. So it should be hands-on, maybe a song or a movement or a video or something that's interesting that they're going to be hooked on the lesson right away. And again, you're going to link it to what they have learned before. Then you go into modeling. This is when you actually show the kids how to do whatever it is you want them to do. Often I see a lot of lessons where you plan for having the students do it, but you don't ever actually demonstrate it for them. So I want to see in your lesson plans that you're demonstrating it. If you want the kids to retell, then I want you demonstrating retelling. If you want the kids to draw a picture and label it, then I want to see you drawing a picture and labeling it. Whatever you're asking the kids to do at the end of the lesson, you should be doing it for them to model it. Then you're going to do guided practice where you give the students a chance to do it under your guidance. So you're going to give them feedback. You're required to show how well you give feedback in edTPA. So you want to build in this point in your lesson where you're going to have them try it a little bit and you're going to be able to tell them what they're doing well or what they need to improve on. For the lower grades, this is fine that this can be done in small group. It doesn't have to be done as part of the whole group. In fact, it's very difficult to do it as whole group. I'd recommend it small group. And you're going to need a video of your whole group lesson and a video of your small group lesson. So your 2 videos can be from the same lesson, one of them in the whole group period and then one of them in the small group period. And then your independent practice is the exact same thing as your formal assessment. So basically, you're going to have the children do it on their own now. The final thing is that you need to integrate vocabulary lessons into teaching vocabulary into all 3 of your lessons. So just pick out a few words or phrases that you're going to focus on during each lesson, and then think about how you will support the students in using those words. Like, you using them is not enough. Saying them aloud is not enough. They want to make sure that the students are using them, and you're going to need a video recording of the students actually saying the vocabulary words. So think that through and how you can get them to say those words. And they can relate to what you're teaching. So if you're teaching retelling, your vocabulary could be character or plot or setting. Those can be your vocabulary words. You're going to need modifications and accommodations. If you have students in special ed, look at their IEP and focus on what needs to be done. This has got to match your context for learning form that I talked about already. So those students with specific learning needs that you identified, in this section, put in there how you're going to modify things for them. Again, they might be in special ed, they might not be in special ed, but these are the kids that you just have to make like changes for so that they can be successful in the lesson. And include your instructional resources and materials. You're going to describe them briefly here. Later on in task 1, you're going to put them in a separate file so you can show examples of them. But don't worry about that right now. For right now, just put a description in your lesson plan. So just to recap, make sure that all 3 plans are on the same topic. They have to have a common focus. So you're teaching the same thing basically in 3 different ways. And they must build on each other in a learning sequence. So think about how you can sequence that to be simpler to more complex, and with each lesson you're building on what they learned in the lesson beforehand. Be sure to read the Early Childhood Handbook, edTPA Handbook, for Task 1 before you write your lesson plans. Make sure you read through all of Task 1. And my plan is that you're going to hand in your lesson plans. I'm going to give you feedback. You'll revise them as needed until they're ready. And then once your lesson plans are ready, then you can move on to do the rest of Task 1, including the planning commentary. So I hope this was helpful, and I wish you all the success in the world.